Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and we have a Braids Arisen Nightmare Aristocrats deck from Beep Boop. Beep Boop says the deck is super high variance currently, with absurd highs when you get Crypt Gas and Cabal Coffers out and fueling the engine, but it can also spend a lot of games just dirtling, waiting for good cards to come around. I'm looking for a way to help minimize the mediocre games and increase consistency. That's definitely something we can do here. Thank you for your submission and thank you for being so specific. As always, this deck list is going to be in the video description below, and I highly recommend you go and take a look before you hear me out, because it's always helpful to see a deck list and see your own opinions and your own arguments that you would make, and then hear mine so then we can compare them. It is an important part of improving at something. Also, this is a very fun deck, and I love Braids. So, who is Braids, and why do I love her? Braids is a 3 mana nightmare in black, 3/3, which is the beginning of your end step. You may sacrifice a permanent, I believe. It doesn't specify, right? An artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. I guess a non-battle. I didn't think of that. So you can't sacrifice battles, but a non-battle permanent. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent with a matching permanent type. If they don't, they lose 2 life and you draw a card. So what this actually means is at the end of each of your turns, you're going to sacrifice a non-battle, and each opponent who can't or won't means you will draw a card. They also take 2 damage, but that's not as important as the absurd card advantage you're going to get from Braids. This is just fantastic. You can just treat her as a draw 3 most of the time, but to be safe, let's say she is a draw 2 at the end of each of your turns, especially if you sacrifice something that either wants to die or comes back from the graveyard. You're going to have a great time. So let's go take a look at the curve. I think the curve is really nice. It goes pretty smoothly, but I will note that we have more in the 6 and 7 than I would expect. This deck doesn't have a lot of ramp. It has some ramp, as the deck builder has noted, with Cabal Coffers, Cabal Stronghold, where's Cryptghast. There's definitely some in here, but I wouldn't consider it to have, endless amounts of ramp, and therefore we're going to be a little picky on our higher mana spells, and perhaps consider a few more ramp strategies in of itself. So, what are our high mana cards that we can look at so we can think of what kind of cards we could be considering cutting to make the deck stronger? Well, we've got Butcher of Malakir and Abhorrent Overlord. Abhorrent Overlord. Abhorrent Overlord Lord feels weird. It is a 7 mana demon that gives you a number of harpies, and then at your upkeep, you sacrifice a creature. Now, this is probably used for its token production, because a 7 mana 6/6 isn't particularly threatening. But the fact that it also has an upkeep cost of constantly sacrificing creatures, most likely the harpies, is kind of not great. Like, don't get me wrong, you should be getting a lot of harpies out of this. And it does represent a scenario where you could then sacrifice a ton of harpies to win the game immediately. I think there's better options that you can have. Like, if you just think of it as a 1-for-1 thing, Great Merchant of Asphodel just does that job better for like 2 less mana if you're thinking about the combo win. And otherwise, if we're just thinking about Aberrant Overlord, there's also scenarios where you play them out by themselves. The board just got wiped and you play this out. You get 2/1/1s, you lose one of them on the next turn, and now you've got a hungry demon to feed constantly, with the upside of just having, you know, a 6/6 really, and a 1/1 that stays around a little. Though a really cool card with really cool art, I don't think it particularly belongs here. Likewise, Butcher of Malakir is interesting, but kind of tricky, right? So Butcher of Malakir is a creature version of Dictate of Erebros, and its cousin just got reprinted, so I'm probably going to Grave What is it? Let's put in 4 mana as well. Grave something. My goodness. Oh, and Grave. Grave Pact. This is a copy of Grave Pact, which just got announced it's getting reprinted. I would just replace Butcher of Malakir with Grave Pact. The fact that it's a creature is almost a downside sometimes. Once again, a 5/4 flying is nothing to be impressive, nothing to tell people about. It's just fine. Whereas Grave Pact comes in for 3 less mana and does that effect, and the 3 black pips isn't too much of a loss for you because you're mono black anyways. Another thing I just want to note, which is kind of peculiar, Butcher of Malakir is kind of weird, and the Grave Pact cards are just kind of weird here because they don't work as you'd expect with Braids. Because Braids, it's not like a activated ability. So Braids trigger goes on the stack. Everyone has to sacrifice. You sacrifice a permanent, right? Let's say you sacrifice a creature. Now, because it's one trigger instead of an activated ability, your opponents then don't sacrifice to Butcher of Malakir until they finish the Braids trigger. And though in some cases that's really good because it further pressures their board and makes them have like bad sacrifices, there is also scenarios where your opponent has one creature in play. You use Braid's ability to sacrifice, let's say reassembling skeleton, the Butcher of Malakir trigger goes on the stack, but then your opponent with one creature just sacrifices the creature, right? It could be their commander, it doesn't matter because they're going to lose it to the Butcher of Malakir trigger anyways, so there's no reason for them not to sacrifice it to Braids to prevent you from drawing a card, right? So with that in mind, it's not necessarily a nombo, but it's just something you need to consider that it doesn't work in your favor in certain scenarios. So those are the ones that come to mind on the higher meta. Kokusho and Gray Merchant and Puppeteer Click are all fantastic black cards at their mana costs, and I have no problem with that. We're gonna come back to Kokusho because the main goal of this is to sacrifice it as many times as possible, so we might have some things to say about that. Looking at our other high mana cards, we have Deadly Tempest. Deadly Tempest is interesting here because uh, I don't think its benefit is really that valuable. I recognize that a lot of Aristocrats decks is a death by 1,000 stings, where, ideally you're going to sacrifice and deal like 3 damage per sacrifice. And Deadly Tempest can add an additional 3 or 4 or 5 damage to each opponent, which can push them into lower life totals. But 6 mana is a lot of mana. Depending on budget, I think like just going into Black's best board clear of Toxic Deluge, and honestly, this is also getting reprinted. It got reprinted in Lord of the Rings, but also just it got announced to be reprinted again. I would definitely just pick up Toxic Deluge. It is the best black mana board clear. It can be asymmetrical, where you can keep creatures if you have the biggest creature on board. But just in general, like I think it'll just be lower on the mana cost, and you won't have to worry about it rotting in your hand when you don't have your like your mana ramp. And I think that's pretty good. Command the Dreadhorde is great. I think this is a great value card, so I'm willing to keep it. And I think that's really it in terms of high mana. Actually, sorry, let's look at these last few. Cauldron of Souls, I think, is just okay. The ceiling is really, really high on this card, but the floor is actually really, really bad, where this card just doesn't do anything if you don't have the right cards in play. Like, it's cool with some aristocratic um, shenanigans, right? Where you have the right cards in play, especially things with 1 life, so that you Cauldron of Souls them, giving them all persist for the turn. You start sacrificing them. They die, trigger your Blood Artists. They come back into play with a -1/-1 counter, immediately die again, triggering your Blood Artist. But if that's like the main way of using it, wouldn't you just be happier with a death dying trigger, like a death trigger doubler, like Drivnod? Like Drivnod here does pretty much the same thing at the same mana cost, whereas it has, well, it's an 8/3, so it's really impressive as a creature, but it also has, an ability to give itself indestructible. And, works generally with a lot of different creatures in different ways and other death triggers. I just like Driven Out a little more. It's just it has a little more utility. It also has the black pips for something like Grey Merchant. So I do like that. Though I will admit Drivnod doesn't work with Grey Merchant's ETB, whereas Cauldron of Souls does. So there is a bit of a push and pull here. Ugin's Nexus feels really, really strange here. Do you have a friend that has a extra turns deck? Because otherwise, I really don't think it belongs here. It is always better at this power level, which is the power level I'm inferring from your deck, to be proactive instead of reactive. And Yugen's Nexus has too much of an opportunity cost. It's a 5 mana artifact to be a reactive play. In fact, there's going to be games that you cast this and nobody takes another extra turn, so you've just wasted 5 mana. Unfortunately, I just don't think it makes the cut. Cage Sun is fine here. I feel like at 6 mana, that's a lot of mana for your ramp spell because you're mainly using it for the ramp spell. But I know it's something you like doing in your deck, so I won't be too rough on it. Okay, the rest of the deck is good, and so let's do some suggestions about consistency and like minimizing mediocre games. Well, a lot of the things I've suggested to cut, I'm hoping will minimize the mediocre games, but let's look at some things for consistency. Namely, I think something, before we go straight into tutors, and I note that you're playing one already, I want to talk a bit about card draw. Card draw is a bit nefarious in a deck like this because we look at Braids Arisen Nightmare and we go, hey, I've got card draw. That's off the list. But that's not how we should actually deck build because you and I both know that it is very, very reasonable to hate Braids out of the game. Braids' trigger is not an ETB, it is end of turn. So when you finish your second main phase before you go to the end step, I'm going to Swords to Plowshares Braids, and then I'm going to do that or an effect like that every time you play Braids. All of a sudden, she's 7 mana. You are out of the game. Now, that's a particularly cruel thing to do, but it is on the table. Well, what do you do for card draw now? Well, you've got Sign in Blood. Okay, you've got Sign in Blood, right? Like, we need a few more things that can do these, and Morbid Opportunist, I'll say. We need a few more of these effects, right? So let's start with the ones that will trigger no matter what. Having generic card draw is often really, really nice because you don't need to jump through hoops. They're reliable. You're playing Sign in Blood, I think that's great. You can also play Read the Bones, another very strong one. After that, usually the ones I always will say is Phyrexian Arena for once a turn, Underworld Connections, which is also every time you tap the land that it's on, will draw you a card. Very nice. Greed is one I also very much suggest here, as you have an interest in producing more and more black mana. Greed is really, really good when you have just a bunch of black mana laying around because it represents a tremendous amount of life. Sorry, cards. It also represents a tremendous amount of life, but cards. But since we have that mana, I'm going to suggest one or two more. I'm going to suggest, depending on your budget, Necropotence is an incredibly powerful card draw in black. But also, Midnight. I'm going to do that thing that people. Oh, it's Moonlight. Sorry. Moonlight Market? Yeah, Moonlight Market. I'm going to do that thing that streamers sometimes do and tell you their secret fun card that they love to play that's actually super cool. And for me, that's Moonlight Bargain. Moonlight Bargain is a 5 mana black instant that looks at the top 5 cards and puts them all in the graveyard unless you pay 2 life a card. This card is really, really good because it is just fantastic at getting you the cards you want at instant speed at the end of a turn cycle, and you don't have to overpay. You only keep the cards you want. If you have cards that you want in your graveyard to reanimate, even better. This one's cute. I'm just saying here to put it on the list. I don't know if I would actually put it in before any other card. But then while we're here, there's a few others you could play. You could easily play Dark Prophecy that says whenever your creature dies, you're going to lose a life and draw a card. That's any creature, including tokens. Midnight Reaper is the other version of that, which is often played in Aristocrat decks. The only difference is Midnight Reaper does require you to have a non-token creature to die to draw a card, but all in all, pretty good. So those are the first ones I think about getting card draw because having additional card draw is just going to be really, really helpful. Beyond that, let's think of a few tutors right off the top. Profane Tutor, which is right here, is a very, very cheap in money and I think generally fair tutor that a deck like this can play. You put it in on turn 2, and then 2 turns later, you get the card you want. Also, Grim Tutor is also a little more expensive, but acceptable. And then there's one more, Mausoleum. Let's see if I spelled that right. Mausoleum Secrets can be incredibly good, but however, is very, very dependent on your graveyard at any given time. However, with a deck like this, I think you can make it happen as long as you have enough creatures to draw the card you want. So, I'm going to quickly talk about tutors in a deck like this. I know sometimes tutors have a pretty bad reputation amongst players as making the game unfun. I would very much like to change that opinion and instead submit the opinion that they make decks not just stronger, but consistent. And it is dependent on the power level of what you're tutoring is going to change how powerful the tutors are, right? But if you think in the sense that green is allowed to mana ramp, right? No one has a problem with someone casting Farseek because in their mind, well, it's not too strong. Well, they are tutoring a card out of their deck and putting it into play. And for decks that work especially well with multiple colors, Farseek is really good because it tutors a specific land, let's say a Triome, into play, giving that player access to 3 colors. When you really think about that, it's incredibly strong what it does. And if you then compare that to something like Diabolic Intent, I think it's particularly fair. Diabolic Intent is going to give up a creature, spend 2 mana to put a card into your deck so that you can continue your gameplay. It's going to be like a land, like accessing your colors, right? It is going to give you the card that allows your deck to work. So you're in black, you have access to tutors. I recommend using 1 or 2 more, rounding out your deck so you can ensure that you grab the cards you want. Then, the next thing I'm going to suggest very briefly is what about a little more variance in your mana, in your fast mana? The 2 ones I'm thinking of, one is kind of a nice one. What is it called? I remember the flavor text. Actually, I can look by flavor text. Thank you, Scryfall. Is sustained. Hate is Wellspring? I guess the flavor text isn't in the database. Let's look at by card instead. So it is a Vampire Spirit, and that should be more than enough. It is not a spirit. Okay. It's the Vampire, tap, swamp. There we go. Nirkana Revenant. Sorry that took so long. Sometimes magic cards elude me, though it's important to see how we can search things up. So, Nirkana Revenant, in either of its wonderful arts, doubles your swamps. It makes all your swamps into 2 black mana instead of 1. Now, it is a 6 mana card, and its other ability isn't as relevant as, for example, Cryptghasts, but it is something to consider. Cryptghast is good. Nirkana Revenant is equally good. So using that as an additional way to get black mana is great. But that's actually not the main card I want to suggest for speeding up your mana. It is actually instead a classic. I would like you to play Dark Ritual. Dark Ritual is one of the oldest cards in Magic that simply turns 1 black mana into 3 black mana. It is an incredibly powerful card, and most people think of it as a combo card or a storm card, but let me tell you a secret that when you have a 3 mana black commander, Dark Ritual is a crazy powerful card. you get to go turn one swamp, dark ritual, braids, sacrifice your swamp. You are behind in mana, but you did just draw a bunch of cards. I think that's cool. I don't know if that's actually something I would suggest once I say it out loud, because maybe that land was a lot more valuable to you than three cards you're almost definitely going to get. Like if you're the first player getting them for sure, but who is sacrificing a land on turn one to stop you from drawing a card? But isn't that a fun play? I think much more realistically, it could be something like turn two, where you play like Cult Conscript, then a Swamp, then Dark Ritual Braids, and then that it's very, very worthwhile, and your engine starts off early. But I think this is also the card that can, ramp you into Cryptghast. It can ramp you into like Black Market. A lot of these cards that are really strong and give you quite a quick advantage in the early game. So those are most of my suggestions. I think this deck is really, really good. I think if you wanted to be a little more, um, let's say, critical of a few cards, you can definitely look around and find a few cards that could be improved. Um, Definitely a little more removal. I think you're playing Malakir Rebirth. I think you could get away with playing a few more of these Feign Death effects. Feign Death, Undying Evil, and Undying Malice are the ones you are playing at one black mana. And I think you could probably get away with playing a few more, especially with Braids. She is vulnerable to dying, and I think having a way to bring her back is really, really good. And the last thing I would probably suggest is playing Carrion Feeder as just another one mana sacrifice outlet, much like Viscera or Viscera. Both of these creatures sacrifice at instant speed with no cost, which are both really, really good for your aristocrat finishers. But also, with Feign Death, it's a way to get your Braids out of danger by letting her die instead of her being path to exiled or something akin to that. So I would start off by adding the card draw, maybe adding some reliable ramp, removing the high mana cards that don't progress your game plan, and then thinking about adding one or two tutors to round out the deck. Those are the things I think would very much increase your consistency. You're playing all of the cards that I think work really well with these kind of strategy. Shoulder of the Apocalypse is a really nice answer to all of the like aggressive card draw I've suggested to you, so that all of a sudden you aren't losing. Like with Greed, it's a zero. It doesn't actually change anything because you are gaining 2 life and losing 2 life. But for things like Phyrexian Arena, Sign in Blood, Read the Bones, it lets you go positive on life, which is something I think is very strong in a mono black deck. Yeah, so I'm really happy with the direction this deck is going. I'd love to see another draft. I would say it's pretty close to being a complete Braids Arisen Nightmare deck. So I do have a vested interest in seeing the next draft. And if nothing else, it just looks like a lot of fun. This is the exact kind of commander I love to play, and I love to get the you know, most games out of in a successful way. So I'm hoping the suggestions will help you get there. All right, with that in mind, if you'd like to send me another draft or any deck in general, there is a link in the video description and on the channel to add yourself to the queue. And if you'd like to skip the queue with a donation, there is also a link there. As always, if you could do the like, comment, subscribe YouTube thing, I'm always grateful because the channel is growing. And I hope to see more Braids. I think Braids is a great card as in the 99 of any commander deck, but I think she's being underused as a commander. So I'd love to see more Braids being played around because she's a great character and she is a great commander. All right, good luck.